Hi. If I were to give one message to youngsters who have just joined architecture, I would say know your rights, not in terms of political rights, but your learning rights. Understand yourself and understand how you can exercise your learning rights. Hi, my name is Sabu Francis, and I am making a set of videos along with some other mentors also to uplift education in architecture. It should be useful for students of architecture, it should be useful for young teachers who want additional material, and it should also be useful for regular practicing architects or anybody who's really interested in understanding what architecture is. In this episode, I will be talking about the context of learning which youngsters have, and I'm going to emphasize it from the point of view of the education situation in India. It took me a fair amount of years to understand all this, and I hope to give you some references. And it starts with the school education system, to be very honest. Now, we are living in a time where some of our elders and some of our grandparents, we were seeped in the Indian culture of learning. And then education system morphed into what the Britishers left us. And they didn't just divide and conquer our country, but they also left us with an education system where they divided and tried to conquer each individual subject. And that's a little unnatural. So you say that here is a whole body of knowledge, and then you carve it up into history and civics and physics and chemistry and biology and all that. And that's how we grew up. And there has been an emphasis on marks and how do you perform. There is no real way to assess it. So this is what happened in school, and then you come into architecture. That's a professional college. But there's another thing which happened when you came into college, which is that you grew up from being a child, and you matured, or you started maturing. The girls have matured a little earlier. The boys are just getting into their hormones and everything. And it's a glorious time, actually. It's a different time from school time. In school time, you were a child, but in a professional college, as an architecture, you are an adolescent. Now, this needs to be understood very deeply. And last 15 years or so, there have been some development in neuroscience, which was pretty revealing, and the way the adolescent brain works. And that's the context which I want you youngsters to know, that what's going on. Around 30% of synaptic connections which is there in the brain, there's 30% more in teenage brain than in adults. So the brain is actually infused with synaptic connections. You can make leaps of imagination, and probably it's some kind of survival instinct, I guess, for that organism, a human as an organism, to get the best chance to understand what is the complex world around. And over time, there's a process called pruning which happens. That's a term which these neuroscientists have used, which reduces these synaptic connections, and an adult brain actually has much lesser synaptic connections than the teenage brain. What does this mean? It means that during this period, you are possibly a little bit more brainy than a lot of your teachers. And that's not something which I'm saying just because I want to please you or something like that. But that's where the situation is. That's how nature is built. Now, in that context, there are other deficiencies also. A long time back, when I was a teenager, I heard Cat Stevens' song called Father and Son. And in that song, I thought the song is very nice, very well constructed, very well composed. But there is one line in that song which irritated me, or two lines. And he said that you're still young. and that's your fault. And I said, why should that be my fault? Like, I mean, what have I done wrong? That was pretty telling, because that song is actually about the generation gap. A father is very calm and quietly telling the son, and the son is all agitated, saying, I want to do this, and my father's not allowing, something of that sort. Now, in that context, to say that it's your fault, probably Cat Stevens is actually pointing out something. So, over time, I started realizing that though this adolescent brain is infused with synaptic connections, but it is not fully formed in many other areas. And especially boys, they're impulsive. Though they can think a lot of different things, but to implement it, they're pretty slow. That's because of another phenomena which is going on in your brain, which is known as development of the myelin sheaths. This is what the neuroscientists say. I do not know how the actual effects happen, but what they say is that a teenage brain thinks about 300 times slower than an adult brain. Slower doesn't mean you're slow. You actually have a lot more ideas, but to implement on those ideas takes time. And this is the kind of context which you must understand. So, and what Cat Stevens was saying is that there are faults which are natural, and since it's inside you, so they are your faults. Not that you deliberately caused those faults, but they are your faults, and you need to understand that there are faults, and you cannot really sit and say that I am really fast in what I'm doing. And if you are really fast, maybe you're a little thoughtless too, probably. And this has got some lessons for young teachers also, which I have observed. I have observed a lot of young teachers, and there's this movement in Indian education in architecture, where a lot of youngsters are joining architecture colleges for good reasons, because they're not getting respect or money in regular architectural firms. So they join as a teacher. They're thinking that, okay, I will teach of some of these youngsters. But the teenage brain actually goes all the way from 18, and they say all the way to 30, 35. You're still technically a teenager in some sort. So this message is actually also for those young teachers. So it's a very peculiar situation. So you have teenagers full of brain, full of imagination, but slow. And then you have young teachers who are also, in one sense, teenagers. They're also excited and impulsive and all that. And they're also infused with a lot of brains. But both of them have got faults, and we need to understand each other. Now, as a student who is doing architecture, you have to orient yourself in a different way than what you would do if you were a school child. If you're say 8th standard, 9th standard, and the teacher says, okay, do this and do this and do this, maybe, that's a separate debate whether it's right or wrong, but there is a systematic or spoon-fed kind of feeling which happens over there. I don't want to get into the debate whether it's good or bad, but that's what's happening. When you come as an architecture student, and then you're growing up in those 5 years in an architecture college, your context is very different. You have different set of hormones. You've already partially becoming an adult. The girls have already become, quite a lot of them have become adults, and they are able to think through. And the gents are catching up, and they're all excited, and there's a lot of brain going on, a lot of imagination and all that. And then they're also very slow in doing their work. They're inefficient in doing their work. This is all part of biology. Nothing wrong there. In that context, if you're spoon-fed again, I think that's going to be a disservice. One of the things which I wish teachers knew this, and colleges implement this, is that during that period, the teacher cannot be an impressive teacher, in the sense that I don't want to go into a college and talk about I don't want a student to to think that I'm a great architect. I'm not. Of course I'm not. And I don't want to really talk about my impressions about what architecture is. You, as a teacher, you need to step out of the way and be a facilitator so that the student does not grow up to the level of the teacher. The teacher ends up as a block. A lot of students come to me when I teach and say, "Sir, is this right? Is this nice?" And I am feeling a little awkward. Obviously, I have something to say about niceness of that design, but I don't know whether it's right for me to say that, because who am I to judge whether it's nice or not nice? Because if I do say it is nice, I will end up as a block. So the student rises up till me and don't go beyond that, because come on, I've already reached this situation where the teacher has already agreed that it is nice. Then what else? Why should I grow further? So step out of the way, let the student grow, and they have to grow beyond that particular teacher. And one of the joys of becoming a teacher is to see students come up with material which makes you as a teacher start thinking, and you say, "Oh my God, I didn't realize that you can look at architecture in this way, and this student told me about it." So I go back home and I start doing my homework about that, and I start thinking, "Oh, that's nice. Okay, there's something new which happened." So a lot of my teaching is because I am stepping out of the way. I hope I am doing that, and the students are growing, and they are coming up with surprises, and they are coming up with things which makes me think, and so therefore I'm also learning. So your right in learning as a student is that please don't get spoon fed. Neither should you expect spoon feeding. B, be in a position to use those synaptic connections inside your brain and tell yourself that, you know what, in this period of my life, I have those synaptic connections, and better, that's an enjoyable experience actually. So I better start figuring out these connections. Many times when I give talks, I get two different kinds of reactions. I get people who are pretty puzzled by what's this guy really talking about? I have not figured it out. I can't stitch it all together. And there is one lot of people who really gets it, and then they sit back and then they debate amongst themselves, and they sit in the canteen or wherever, and then they start saying that this is what Sabu had said. Oh, you know what? And they argue. That's the situation which I really like, because I want to precipitate discussions. It's a ploy from my side not to really directly tell you things that, okay, do this as in architecture, do that in architecture, do this is nice and that is wrong. So as a teacher, you are doing a different thing than as an architect. As an architect, I have my methodologies, I have my tools, I have my various ways to go about designing. But when I am in the role of a teacher, I have to be very different. And in that difference, I can only provoke these synaptic connections and spin them around into lots of different material which is there, which needs to be put in front of the students. And some of the students have already realized this, that they can handle that. Some of them haven't. And the people who have not realized it, they are still, many of them are still in that school mode that, when I was in school, there's the syllabus, and in the syllabus had these points, and the teacher explained those points. But I come here, and in architecture colleges, anything goes, and nothing really is explained. At least with me, I am reasonably famous, I think, for not marking people and not telling something is nice or not nice, because I think that may end up robbing the rights of those teenage students. Now, there are other positions. There are teachers who tell me that you need to mark and you need to assess, and then you need to stick to the syllabus. And this is some of the conflicts which comes up time and again whenever I teach. And I feel that it is very important for a teacher to respect the rights of the student, and that rights is to keep encouraging them to make these synaptic connections and utilize those synaptic connections. There's this wonderful book, unusual book, I would say, not just wonderful, it's pretty unusual for an architect to talk about all these issues and then write a book about it. It's called The Reasoning Architect. It's by an Australian architect by the name of Gary Stevens. He's had his own share of controversies. If you see on the net, there were some other issues with this particular author, but that book is pretty well written, and he comes up with one insight that why is it that in architecture the real masters of architecture are very old. I mean, they're literally in the 60s and 70s before they were noticed as architects who are worthy, who are producing work which is which has some deeper meanings and effect on life. Like who remembers a very young Louis Kahn who's just 28 years old? Maybe later on people have put in some backstories, but when those architects were growing up, they actually bloomed in their 60s and 70s, which gives me a lot of hope, because hopefully I'll be a useful architect a few years from now. I'm already 58. What does this mean? What Gary Stevens was saying is that architecture is that subject which requires you to balance many different ways of thinking and then put them together, put those different types of thinking together, and then also work on many different streams of subjects, many different subjects. Like, I kind of keep an analogy of a lot of rivulets forming a river, and that river going and joining the sea. The actual really meaningful stuff happens when that river joins the sea, but before that there's a lot of rivulets of knowledge which needs to be joined together, processed, and you have to overcome all the turbulence over there, and then it can go into the sea properly. It cannot happen. I mean, the chances of it happening when you're very young is a little less. I think the only really young architect whom I can remember who's a master architect was Jan Utzon, who did the Sydney Opera House. I think he won the competition in his late 30s or early 40s or something like that. I can't think of any master architect who was very, very young. Why am I mentioning this? Is because look at the situation. Here is a bunch of teenage, adolescent students, and here are teachers over there. Are we really masters in our subject? No, we are not. That's the crude reality. That's the blunt reality. Why are we trying to comment on what is nice and what is not nice? Who are we really? Okay. Now, if I am, say, B.V. Doshi, who's got the Pritzker, of course, I have some huge amount of backdrop of material for me to tell the students, and therefore to listen to B.V. Doshi would make a lot of sense. Listening to Charles Correa, if he was alive, would make a lot of sense. But if a young architecture teacher is opining on what is right and what is wrong and all that, I, as a student, would take that with a huge pinch of salt, because you cannot walk into architecture with this kind of notional opinions of what is there. And a lot of these opinions are actually second-hand and third-hand and fourth-hand information. So somebody reads a book, and that book, the author of that book has gone and seen some work of architecture and making a commentary on that. For all you know, some of these authors have not even seen that particular thing, and they are making a commentary based on some other book. And then, somebody writes some evocative prose for some piece of architecture, and that particular young teacher has got impressed, and the teacher comes into class and, hello, is that all necessary? We as students of architecture needs to know our learning rights and also needs to know our faults, like the way Cat Stevens says. And then, and only then, can really good learning happens. Now, I'm not trying to say that you should quarrel with all your teachers about all this and say, no, you should not do this, and you cannot say something is right or something is wrong. There are situations when there are really dumb things, like if somebody makes a staircase and the staircase goes into a dead wall and you can't go into that, of course that's a flaw and that's bad design. So don't use this material to quarrel with your teachers. What I'm trying to do is to build up your own confidence and give yourself time, John Lennon had a song called Beautiful Boy, and he says the same thing in that song. He's saying that there's a hard row to hoe. You have to row the boat, and it's pretty hard. It's not going to come easily. You can't say that, no, I'm a teenager, I've got a lot of brains, and I need to know, you have to agree with what I have to say. No, you have to win that rowing. And that rowing takes time. So that's a hard row to hoe, and you need to really put in that effort over there, debate accurately, debate without fallacies, and understand that probably you would be impulsive, and forgive yourself for that, and then come back and then get the meat of the matter properly and debate that healthily with your teachers. And teachers also should understand that that's a phase which we've never skipped. That phase, we are all there. I can remember me being quite a wild guy in IIT when I was a student there. So it's nothing unusual. We've all gone through it. So teaching and learning architecture in that period of time, you need to encash what are your learning rights, and your learning rights means populating your brain with a lot of material, make a lot of different synaptic connections, and then figure out what's the way to go ahead in your architectural career. Gary Stevens makes a lot of other points also. Like he points out that there have been very young masters in, say, pure sciences, mathematics, and pure physics, and all that subjects. Newton was very young. Leibniz was very young when they discovered things in maths and physics and all that. Évariste Galois was a Frenchman, and there's a major story about how he wrote down the equations of the area of symmetry. He had talked about the mathematics of symmetry, coincidentally, and then he died. He died very young. So there's a lot of very, very important masters in other subjects who are very young, not in architecture. It's going to be a big shock for somebody who thinks that, no, I'm really a nice architect and I know all the sensitivity of being an architect. For all you know, you may be parroting some book, or some immature teacher has kind of propped you up and said that your design is really good. That's your fault. There's so much to know, and there's nothing wrong in knowing that you have faults. Those faults were not created by you. You are not one who deliberately went around saying that, no, I'm going to be dumb. That's not what Cat Stevens said. What Cat Stevens said, that there are fractures in your logic, and you need to know that they are fractures. And there's nothing unhealthy about it. It's quite uplifting to know that, okay, let's see how best this can all be put together. So thank you so much. My name is Sabu Francis, and me and my colleagues are making these videos to uplift architecture, especially in India. And I hope to see you in my next videos. Thank you.